Good day, North Lakes. We want to welcome you to our YouTube channel. We are here to review what we talked about last week in our message and look forward to this Sunday. So we are going through a message series called Soul Detox, and we are looking at some specific things that the world has within it that can be very toxic to ourselves, our relationship with others, and our relationship to God. And so we just completed our first third of those messages, going into this second third. And the first third was really all about how the messages of the world can get those toxic messages from the world, those negative messages, get into our brains and how they can affect our thinking. This third is actually going to be specifically dealing with emotions, things that we are feeling, and how the world affects those and can really have a negative and damaging effect on our lives. Not only our lives personally, but on the relationships that we have with others, and again, our relationship with God. So this week, I spoke on these bitter roots of the emotion we call anger and resentment. Hebrews 12:14-15 says, "Pursue peace with all men and the sanctification without which no one will see the Lord. See to it that no one comes short of the grace of God, and that no root of bitterness springing up causes trouble, and by it many will be defiled." So this idea of resentment or bitterness, God identifies as something that will cause trouble for us, and it will defile us, or it will make us sick. It will cause something that's healthy to be unhealthy. And I thought I'd share a little bit about how that happens. It's this poisonous resentment and anger that can really get into our hearts, our very souls. And how does that poison bloom or blossom? And I got to tell you that when we deal with the sins and disappointment of others, it just immediately begins this cycle within us. It's like a progression. It's something that I share with married couples. Mainly I share with young couples just starting out, but with all different types of relationships, whether it's work relationships, family relationships, romantic relationships, friendships. Every relationship we have, if it's going in a negative way, it's probably started with this progression or this cycle, and I'm going to share it with you today. It's something that you might want to write down, because if you're experiencing some of this form of frustration, anger, resentment, I can guarantee you 100% that you're somewhere in this cycle. It all starts with expectations. We all have expectations of what something will be. And when those expectations aren't met, well, in the beginning, especially in a relationship, when those expectations are not met, we think, oh, those are cute. They're adorable. We celebrate our differences even sometimes. Even to the point where it's something silly, like whether I squeeze the toothpaste in the middle and my partner rolls it up from the bottom. And in the beginning, those things are very cute, but when we don't talk about those expectations and we don't talk about those with our partner, those things can happen over and over. And every time that we see that, at first it's cute, but then it begins to be something else. When it continues, we say, oh, we're disappointed. We might be disappointed, oh, they haven't changed to do it the way that I do it. And that disappointment becomes a disappointment day after day after day, and then it continues, and then it becomes frustration. And that frustration continues and continues and continues, and then that becomes anger. And when that anger goes on and on and on, then it finally blossoms into resentment and bitterness. Finally, when that anger and bitterness and resentment lasts for a while, it becomes what we call ambivalence, or this idea that you don't really even care anymore. And at that point, the relationship dies. It's at that point that we get to that final straw. And then we may hate the other person, or we're angry at the other person, and sometimes we don't even know why. But it's just a buildup of all these expectations that have happened. And it doesn't even have to be a relationship. It can be an event that happened to us. It can be something that happened, and most of the time, it's a lot of the times it's beyond our control. This idea that you might go into expectations that you'll never lose a child to death, or that you'll never experience any health problems. Those might be your expectations. You might have this expectation that nothing will ever go bad in your life. When those expectations aren't met, you have to really be careful, because that's when that cycle can begin. Sometimes it's because our expectations are not realistic. Sometimes it's because we go into things with maybe rose-colored glasses, thinking everything's going to be fine, and then when it's not, that cycle of disappointment, frustration, anger, resentment, and bitterness can begin. That was point number one, this idea of that cycle. So write that down. That's going to be very helpful for you in your relationships and in your walk, to be able to recognize that worldly poison. The other thing we talked about was this idea of Fruit Loops. Matthew 7:18 says, "A good tree cannot produce bad fruit, nor can a bad tree produce good fruit." The problem is that often the bitter person, if you are dealing with this anger and bitterness over something that's happened in your life, the problem is that a bitter person oftentimes doesn't even know that they're bitter. It's like a good tree producing bad fruit and not even knowing it. It's this idea that, oh, wow, I just think that this is my permanent state of mind, that I'm in a permanent state of negativity, bitterness, and resentment. And we may be feeling that based on a broken expectation, or an event, or a bad relationship that we've had in the past, or an abusive relationship we've had in the past, and we become that. And we think that we're okay, but really we're full of that resentment and bitterness, and it comes out in our language, in our thinking, in our behavior. It's kind of like Fruit Loops. When Fruit Loops first came out, it was spelled F-R-O-O-T, loops. And the reason they couldn't spell it the real way was because it didn't have any fruit in it. The regulations said, no, you can't call yourself Fruit Loops if you don't have fruit as a part of the cereal, the little fruit rings. Now they spell it the right way, F-R-U-I-T. But back then when they started, they couldn't, because they wanted to be true to the actual name. And we want to be that way too. Although we think we're not affected by the sins of others or these events that happen in our life, that somehow we can get over those things, that we are strong enough. It's something that happened in our past and it doesn't bother me anymore. We can go on to live productive and positive lives because we're strong and we're independent. And in a sense, we're trying to be Fruit Loops. We're trying to be okay. We're trying to be Fruit Loops, F-R-U-I-T, when really we're F-R-O-O-T. We're trying to be something that we can't be, because our hearts are full of resentment and bitterness, and it becomes hard to truly produce that truly mature, juicy, ripe, wonderful tasting fruit. It's just an artificial flavored version of life that we're living. And the way that we can tell that that's the way it is because our lives are unfulfilling. We go out and we do all kinds of fun things, and we travel, we party, we do all these fun things with our friends that are supposed to be life-giving, but at the end of the day, our hearts are empty, and we have no joy, and our life is not fulfilled. And most likely it's because we're living an artificially flavored life. We're not living our true life. Our true self is not being realized. What God intended for you to be is not being realized because your heart and your soul is being tainted and poisoned by a resentment or a bitterness that's happened in the past. Now, I know about this all too well because my experience with abuse at the hands of my stepfather, I realized that my heart was full of bitterness. My heart was full of anger, resentment. And so for many years, I lived with that in my heart. And in order to get by in life, I became whatever I needed to be. My behaviors, my thoughts, my words. I chose to do things not based on a genuine heart, but from a heart full of those toxic emotions. So, I might have said the right things. I might have tried to do the right things. I maybe was thinking the right things, but in a sense, they were artificial flavorings. They were not the genuine me. They were the me that I allowed others to see because I was covering up something that I never wanted anybody to know or discover. I was Fruit Loops, F-R-O-O-T. I wasn't the genuine me. It wasn't until after years of processing and adjustments and, changes in my thinking, allowing God to heal my heart, that I became my genuine self, what God had intended for me to be all along from the very beginning. I became truly Fruit Loops, F-R-U-I-T. And that's who stands before people today. I am my genuine self. One of the things I shared on Sunday was it was really, really difficult for me to make that process because one of the biggest fears that I had was that if I start being my genuine self, the self that God created me to be, being open and vulnerable and honest, if I was to be that, I felt like, and I was afraid that no one would really like me. And that was a big fear, and maybe that's something you feel as well, that you can't address that bitterness and anger from something that's happened to you in the past. Because if you do, you're afraid that people won't like you anymore, or people won't like the new you and who that is. I would just let you know that you're much better off addressing these poisonous things that get into our hearts and our soul, these things that make us angry and bitter. How do we remove it? That was the last thing we talked about. How do we get rid of it? Well, it's hard. It's difficult. It involves probably opening our hearts and our minds to other people to help us. It might involve counseling. It might involve, months and months of counseling, depending on what you're dealing with when it comes to these, feelings of anger and resentment and bitterness. Ephesians 4:31 and 32 says to us an encouragement to us: let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and slander be put away from you, along with all malice. Be kind to one another, tenderhearted, forgiving each other, just as God in Christ has forgiven you. So we take God's example, his example of sending his son Jesus, the love and the kindness and the compassion that God must have had in order to send his son to die for our sins and wrongdoings. Let's take that love, compassion, and concern, and let's be kind to one another, tenderhearted to one another, tenderhearted to ourselves when it comes to having to deal with these things. There used to be a plumbing company when I grew up called Roto-Rooter, and they would advertise on the TV, and they would guarantee to come in and clean those pipes out. And that's really what we need to do. We need to look down deep into our soul, and whatever those clogged pipes are, we need to get rid of the things that are clogging us up. And the only way to remove those things is to kill it at the root. And the only way to kill it at the root is through forgiveness. And I know that's difficult. It's really, really hard. It sounds easy, but trying to forgive someone that's deeply wounded you, or trying to forgive a situation or an event that's happened to you, that's been painful and caused you to suffer, it's a tough one. Discovering what God's command for us includes knowing that He commands us to forgive. And not only because that's what He wants, but because He knows that that's the thing that will lead to true healing. For years, I tried to live my way. I tried to stuff those feelings down. I tried to put it in a closet so no one would find it. I tried to just feel that anger and bitterness in my private time so that I wouldn't affect anybody else. And I tried to do that for many, many years, blocking it out, trying not to allow people to know what I was hiding in my heart. And all the while, that bitterness and resentment was growing and growing. And I would find myself blowing up at the most inopportune times. I would find myself getting angry at things I shouldn't have been angry about. And surprise, surprise, doing it my way doesn't work. So when my world fell apart, I decided to try to do it God's way. And I began by slowly praying for my abuser. I wasn't very good at it at first. It was half-hearted at best. As a matter of fact, I spent most of the time telling God how much He hurt me and how terrible a person He was. And I would usually end by saying, but bless him anyway, yada, yada, yada. I did, however, find that through consistently and constantly praying for him, that I began to change. I began to become stronger. I began to become more bold. My heart was changing. My heart was lighter. I started to feel more normal and more empowered and more like the real me. And I'm not sure that my prayers were changing my abuser, but they were changing me. And they were changing the way that I looked at life. They were changing the way that I looked at what happened to me. And as more and more time passed, more and more prayers of love, prayers of forgiveness, slowly the root of bitterness and anger was fading away. And the toxic poison that had made me poisonous was starting to subside. Now, don't get me wrong, and big note here, I was able to forgive my abuser, but for my own well-being and for my own mental health, I gotta tell you, I had to limit my contact with him. I had to limit my association with him. So I don't want you to think that you have to, in order to forgive, you have to come to some complete resolution where you're in constant contact or even in a positive, relationship with someone. Sometimes we still have to have those boundaries up. We live in a world that's uncertain. It's becoming more uncertain all the time. Life in this world is uncertain, but we need to understand that eternity, that place where God has prepared for us, a place that we're going, a place that we're going to be together with Him, that is not uncertain. We live in a world full of negative things. We are influenced by negative things, negative people that do things to us. We're full of negative events that happen to us. We're not promised that those things won't happen, but we are promised that if we react to those things in a way that is healthy and godly, that bitterness and resentment won't take over our hearts and our soul and our minds. You will never be more like God than when you forgive. We need to let those things go. We need to kill the root and be set free from that toxic emotion of bitterness and resentment. I would just encourage you this week, if you weren't there on Sunday, I encouraged everybody to really look at Ephesians 4:31-32 in your Bibles. Really start to pray through that and start to ask God to allow you to get to know what that means. Ask God to reveal what those things are that has caused that anger and resentment and frustration that's in your heart, and help Him to understand how you're feeling by telling Him, and ask Him if you could just begin that one step of praying through maybe that event that happened, and praying for maybe that person that hurt you, and he will honor the work that you do on that. So I love you guys. If any of you are hurting, if any of you are dealing with some really difficult things, happy to sit down and talk with you and counsel you, and really walk with you through that a little bit, or get you the help that you might need, because this is an important thing. This is something that sticks with people their whole lives unless they deal with it, unless they process it, and allow God to heal their hearts from it and become that true, genuine person that God intended for them to be. So happy to help you with that. So we appreciate you sticking with us through this little bit longer review, but this was a hard one, and this was an important one for you to start thinking through. This week we have a special speaker, Miles Mason, coming up from Sydney, and we're really thankful that Miles is taking some time to be with us, and he's going to be guiding us through this next emotion, the emotion of envy. This idea of coveting or desiring the things that someone else has. That could be anything, from material possessions to a relationship. And so I really am looking forward to see what Miles has for us, and perhaps we can learn to be a little bit more content with the things that we have ourselves. So look forward to seeing you on Sunday. Please come in early for coffee, 9 to 10. 10 o'clock is our worship time and message time, and then stay a little bit longer for morning tea. So God bless you, church, and we'll see you Sunday.